And there's that cop. And I'm getting pulled over. The beautiful thing, looking at this police officer behind me, is that I'm driving the speed limit. Yes. Hello everyone and welcome. I am finally driving my supercharged Miata. Everything works. Life is good. So let's talk about this car. Let's talk about dyno charts, what happened before and after as far as horsepower and torque, what acceleration is like now that it's supercharged, all the good, all the bad, that kind of thing. Just walk through this project now that it's finally pretty much done and the car is working great. Let's get right to the point with horsepower. So I did 4 different dyno runs, actually a bunch of different dyno runs, but 4 different tunes. So the stock car, naturally aspirated, that made 144 horsepower at the wheels, 139 for torque. Then I used a naturally aspirated tune that I put on the car at Fab 9 tuning, and that gave it another 10 horsepower. So it was at about 155 horsepower, very similar torque, about 140 pound-feet of torque. So it raised the red line and it increased the torque on the top end. So actually, that naturally aspirated tune makes this ND1 Miata act a lot like the next generation ND Miata, the ND2, which has 181 horsepower and a raised red line. All right, so how about the Supercharger? So if you haven't yet seen the install with Charles and some of the problems I ran into with it, I'd recommend checking out those videos. But Edelbrock has sent me a new tune, and so I'm not running into any boost issues anymore, regardless of which tune I'm running. And so with the Edelbrock tune, the one that comes with the kit, it is making 192 horsepower at the wheels, 184 for torque. And then finally for the Fab 9 tune, which is this is now running, 210 horsepower, a lot of that because of an increased red line. The Edelbrock kit has that same 6,800 RPM red line. One of the advantages of that Edelbrock tune is simply the fact that you get the Edelbrock warranty for your powertrain and it's emissions compliant. So now with the Fab 9, 210 horsepower at the wheels, 188 pound-feet of torque. And that is a very significant bump. I was excited to see these numbers. I mean, it's about 37% more horsepower, 30% more torque. I think it's like 66 horsepower and about 50 added horsepower, I think 49. Now keep in mind, looking at these dyno plots, dynos are extremely finicky machines. So don't look at all of this as like the exact word of what is 100% accurate about this system, but it's nice to see a before and after. Also, we're using roller speed, so don't exactly pay too much attention to the RPM. The RPM is slightly off just because we're using roller speed for calculating at what RPM these powers are happening. But the beautiful thing, looking at this police officer behind me, is that I'm driving the speed limit. The beautiful thing looking about the torque curve is that it's just all bumped up. So you can look at that torque curve, it's nice and flat before, and it's nice and flat after, and it just bumps up. And above 3,000 RPM, which is where we're really starting to measure this, you can see across that whole rev range, you're lifting up the torque curve. So that's fantastic. It means you always have usable torque. Versus the style supercharger that I used on my S2000, the centrifugal style, it only adds on the top end. So this is adding everywhere because it's a root style supercharger, very cool. Love the way that it feels and how it just lifts up the entire torque curve. Now, what does this all translate to as far as real world acceleration? So I did acceleration runs in first, second, and third, and then calculated G-forces in each of those. So looking at the actual force pressing you into your seat. What is that force? That's, I think the best way of talking about acceleration, rather than 0 to 60, which is a time, it includes shifting, there's other variables in there. So the force actually pressing me into my seat, I looked at, and so I'll display all of those before and after putting on the supercharger in first, second, and third gear. And pretty impressive to see. I mean, in first gear, this thing's accelerating at 0.65 G. So what does that mean? Well, if you lay down on the ground, you feel 1 G pulling you down. This is 65% of that. And that's actually pretty good. As a comparison, I started trying to find a car out there with similar acceleration numbers to kind of give an idea of what this is like, and it lines up almost perfectly with the Honda Civic Type R based on Motor Trend's test data. So in first gear acceleration, in second gear acceleration, it falls in line with a Honda Civic Type R as far as what the acceleration feels like. And sure, the Civic Type R is front-wheel drive, so in that first gear, it may not be capable of putting down all the power because it doesn't have, that weight resting on the powered wheels, which is what's going on with the Miata. You floor it, you get extra weight on those rear tires. But the Civic Type R also is front heavy. It's about a 62-38 distribution, so it does have good first gear acceleration. And this, with the Supercharger, is matching that in first, matching it in second. And that torque is just flat, and that's what's so cool about it. The force putting you into your seat is greater in every single gear by about 20 to 30% looking at G-forces. So it's definitely noticeable, and I think it feels fantastic. Now, I won't pretend that it is all 100% glamorous. There's one thing that has kind of been a reoccurring theme with this Supercharger kit that keeps popping up, and it has given me all new respect for OEs and their throttle tuning, because Mazda's throttle tuning, which is far, far more complicated than it sounds as far as it's not just simply an accelerator pedal matches your throttle position. It's not nearly that simple, and it's given me an all new respect in how challenging throttle pedal feel is with electronic throttles. And I know a lot of people are quick to jump on electronic throttles and say they're garbage. I don't believe that. I think there are many real, genuine advantages to electronic throttles, and I think if you drive a stock Miata, you will know that it can be done well because they do a very good job with it. The challenge is switching over to the Supercharger. Some of the aspects of how the throttle pedal feels have changed, and that is kind of an advantage of mechanical throttles. Like when I supercharged my Honda S2000, it's a mechanical throttle. You don't notice a difference in how the pedal feels, before and after supercharging. So two issues that I've noticed that are kind of a bit annoying with it. First of all, shifting from first to second at low throttle applications, it blips the throttle when you shift. And so it's kind of like a bad rev match, not a bad rev match, a bad rev hang, where it blips the throttle as you shift from first to second. Even when you're basically not on the throttle, you let off, throttle position actually increases slightly, and then it closes. And so it kind of makes low speed, low RPM gear shifts from first to second a bit annoying. It doesn't seem to be nearly as bad in any of the other gear shifts. And again, this is only with low throttle positions. If you're at wide open throttle or 60% throttle, you don't notice it. It's only when you're driving around the city and you're just kind of puttering around, it has that bad rev hang from first to second. The other part is the throttle closure seems really abrupt for how different you change your accelerator pedal position. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you're on the throttle pedal and you're just barely on the throttle pedal and then you let off, you get a noticeable closure of that throttle pedal. And to me, my feeling is if I'm just barely on the throttle, it should be very close to zero. And if I let off, it really shouldn't feel significant. And sure, there's going to be a fuel cut that you'll feel, but really, I didn't feel anything before, and now, with this tune on it, with the Supercharger, there's a very noticeable throttle closure when you let off the gas, even if you're at maybe 1% and you go to zero. It has this notable kind of lurch forward. And it's not like it's bad, it's not like... Basically, I'm just trying to say it's noticeable. The only real drivability issue that I'm not stoked on so far is that low speed shift first to second. And again, I think this stuff can be worked out with some tuning. That's just a matter of getting it all sorted out. So overall, as far as the throttle pedal is concerned, that 0 to 25% throttle isn't quite there yet. Anything above that is fantastic. You actually get very different torque, from 50% throttle to 75% to 100% throttle. And I like that you have that control and it's actually noticeable, not just an on-off switch, which you commonly will get that feel with turbocharged engines where it's just on or off. And I really like the way the throttle feels from about 25% to 100%. You have a lot of control as far as how much torque you're putting down. Now, I think a very reasonable question you might ask is, hey Jason, if I want to maintain the warranty, if I want to maintain emissions compliant and I go with the Edelbrock kit and the Edelbrock tune, Why would I spend all that money and trouble going for, 192 horsepower rather than just getting the new ND2 Miata, which has 181 horsepower? All that trouble for 10 extra horsepower. Well, two very good points to counter that question. First of all, this is power at the wheels, not power at the crank. So it's 181 at the crank versus this is 192 at the wheels with the Edelbrock tune. Probably closer, over 200 horsepower at the crank if you were to measure it. So it is a bigger difference than it sounds. It's not just 10 horsepower. Second, the new Miata's engine really doesn't have much more torque than the previous this engine. So both the ND1 and the ND2 Miata, whether it's a 2016 engine or a 2019 engine, have very similar torque, and they have the same gear ratios. The reason why the newer Miata has more power is because it revs higher. So what that means is the actual feeling of you getting pushed back into your seat does not change between this engine and the newer engine. What changes is how long you can stay in gear. And with the Supercharger kit, the wheel torque is absolutely not the same. It's significantly greater with the Supercharger. So the feeling that you actually get being pressed back into your seat, even with the previous engine, 192 horsepower versus 181, is going to be 20 to 30% greater than in that new Miata. One thing I forgot to mention, and I'm a bit ashamed of, is that my acceleration results for the stock car are actually with the Versa tuner and One Tune. So it's actually the tuned, naturally aspirated car, not the stock car. And so as a result, the wheel torque really shouldn't be much different. They have extremely similar wheel torque, but it might have a slight advantage, meaning my percentage increase might be slightly more over stock. The Supercharger numbers that I'm showing, I'm saying 20 to 30%. It may be, 21 to 31%, 22 to 32%, somewhere in that region. It might be slightly better. All right, now let's chat about reliability, because a lot of people have asked me, Jason, aren't you afraid that your transmission's going to blow up? And apparently there have been issues with ND Miata transmissions. And so here's what I want to say about this. I think any conversation about parts failures, you should look at data rather than anecdotes, because if you have one person saying their transmission failed, doesn't really mean anything. If you have 100 people saying their transmission failed, but there's 200,000 cars out there, doesn't really mean anything. So context is extremely important. Now, in this case, I think Mazda has acknowledged that they have had issues with some of the earlier model year transmissions. And this is a 2016, so it's the first version transmission out there. And a lot of people have been like, Jason, it's probably gonna fail. And here's the thing. Maybe it will. That is a part of project cars, and it's you cannot go into modifying a car, not changing the transmission, not changing the differential, not changing the engine and internals, and just assuming everything will be wonderful forever. That's part of modifying a car. You will decrease reliability almost always. So it's not that I'm going into this thinking, oh, everything's going to be glamorous and 100% fine all the time. If things break, they break. That is a project car, that is part of it. You definitely shouldn't go into, just throwing a Supercharger on a car if you want that original warranty and original reliability. That's just not how it works. So I am certainly aware that the transmission could fail, and if it does, well, we replace it. That's what happens. So another really big challenging thing from a design standpoint is when you design an automatic transmission, you can control almost everything, right? You can control how it shifts, when it shifts, that sort of thing. With manual transmissions, that control is taken out of the engineer's hand. So they have to design something that they think will work well and they think that people won't ruin. But they can't control how people drive. And I'm not trying to blame this on drivers. I'm just saying with a manual transmission, reliability, part of that reliability equation is put on the driver. There is a portion of it, because you can trash a manual transmission very quickly if you want to. If you genuinely want to destroy it, it's not hard to do. With an automatic, it's quite a bit more challenging because there's so many controls in place to prevent that from happening. All right, enough ranting about the transmission. Oh, and there's that cop. And I'm getting pulled over. I even saw you on the way over. I don't have a mask. I apologize.
That's fine. What was that all about?
I know. I even saw you on the way over, and here I am being an idiot literally right in front of you.
I mean, you were on the speed limit and then you accelerated.
I am dumb. That's what that was about.
Let me just see all your information. I'll give you a
Sure, no problem. Here's my license.
Here? What's this?
Okay, so this is, it's a I just put a supercharger on this Miata. So I run a YouTube channel, it's called Engineering Explained, and I teach about how cars work. So I've been having a lot of problems with this car. The throttle tuning has been all off, where it wouldn't ever get into boost. And the reason was the accelerator pedal says it's at 100%. The communication from the car to the throttle pedal says open up all the way, and the throttle pedal would just sit at 25. And so it wouldn't work. And finally I've been working with this shop to figure it out and get the tune on, and somehow now it works.
Is it all electronic?
It is. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a challenge with new cars, is the throttle pedal isn't mechanical anymore, it's electronic. So the communication is somehow broken, and now it's fixed, but yeah, I accelerated. Yeah, I know. And I've got my insurance somewhere in here, if you don't mind me.
You need the registration number?
Yes.
Yeah, don't worry about it, I'll just run the plate.
Okay.
Be right back.
Yep.
You're all set. Please watch speed, all right?
I will do. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Well, there's a master class on being an idiot. I saw the cop on the drive down, and yet when I got back to him on the same section of road that he had been sitting that entire time, that's when I decided to speed. Good going, Jason. Brilliant execution. So what have we learned overall? Well, Supercharged Miata, I absolutely love it. Apparently it's going to start getting me into trouble, but yeah, the power is great, acceleration is fantastic, still feels like a Miata. You don't really feel any of that weight difference, and as far as straight line acceleration, it can put it all down, but when you go in a corner, you can get the rear end to kick out a bit more easily just because it has a bit more power. Overall, I love this thing. It's a fantastic machine, and for my drive home, I'm going to go the speed limit and obey traffic laws. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below.